And welcome to the Counter Narrative Project presents our webinar, Approaches to Trauma, Intersectionality, and Social Justice. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Johnny Cornegay, Network Director for the Counter Narrative Project, and I am pleased to welcome you to our discussion. The mission of the Counter Narrative Project is to build power among Black gay men. We do this through community mobilization, media organizing, policy advocacy, and training. You can visit our website at thecounternarrative.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at Building Desire, and you can like us on Facebook at The Counter Narrative. During your presentation, you will see at the bottom of the screen our social media information, and we do encourage you to tweet and share information that you learn during this webinar. As for our agenda today, we will have introductions and then presentations by our speakers. We will have a Q&A from our moderator to our speakers, and then we will open it up for questions for everyone who is joining us today. So, for the duration of the webinar, all participants will be on mute. However, you can share your questions. Here's how. You should, on your control panel, you will see a questions section. You should go ahead and expand that section. You will type your question in the box, and then you will press send. Once again, you will expand the questions section. You will type your question in the box, and then you will press send. Thank you. We want to thank our sponsor, AIDS United. AIDS United's mission is to end the AIDS epidemic in the United States, and you can find more information on AIDS United at aidsunited.org. We do thank them for their support. We will have three presenters today. We will have Charles Stevens, who will moderate today's discussion, actually, and he is the founder and executive director of the Counter Narrative Project. We have Abigail A. Sewell, Dr. Abigail A. Sewell, assistant professor of sociology at Emory University, and Kevin A. Jefferson, Ph.D. student in public health from Emory University. Charles Stevens will open up our webinar and will guide us through the rest of the discussion. Charles, can we hear you?
Yes, I'm on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Why don't I just jump in? Again, everyone, welcome to our webinar this afternoon. I'm appreciative of you joining us. And so I'm going to actually take us through a bit of context around trauma-informed care to provide a bit of context for our discussion. Next slide, please. So before we go forward, we should probably begin by defining trauma and talking a little bit about what we mean when we say trauma. Trauma can refer to one experiencing negative events that provoke emotional and psychological distress. Trauma could be a singular experience or a series of distressing experiences and disturbing occurrences that leave lasting emotional scars. Next slide, please. According to SAMHSA, individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Next slide, please. Let me also say before we go further that though trauma is often spoken about, particularly in the public health context, as a personal or individual experience, on our webinar this afternoon, we're going to talk a lot about trauma from a collective or a systemic perspective. Next slide, please. I also want to bring historical trauma into this conversation. Historical trauma has been defined as cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma experiences. Again, we want to think about trauma not only from a personal or individual perspective, but also from a collective perspective. And as we're talking about, marginalized communities, communities of color specifically, it's important that we think about trauma from a community or collective perspective, since experiences of racism, homophobia, gender violence, oppression, systematic structural violence will undoubtedly contribute to a community's experience of collective trauma. Next slide, please. Trauma-informed care has been put forth as a way to, particularly in clinical settings, to address the trauma that an individual may show up with. Trauma-informed care is an overarching framework that emphasizes the impact of trauma and that guides the general organization and behavior of an entire system. So trauma is a framework. Next slide, please. Maxine Harris describes a trauma-informed service system as a human services or healthcare system whose primary mission is altered by virtue of knowledge about trauma and the impact it has on the lives of consumers receiving services. Next slide, please. So to talk a bit more about trauma-informed care, it can refer to a delivery of interventions, workshops, and so forth. It can suggest a service provider or clinician making referrals. It can also suggest, again, it's a framework, creating an environment that supports positive outcomes for clients. So trauma-informed care can exist from an individual service provider to client perspective, and it can also exist organizationally within an institutional perspective. Next slide, please. Trauma-informed care operates in an empowerment model. It emphasizes strength and resiliency. Often, I think, particularly in the public health realm, but in other within other institutions, communities, particularly communities of color, are seen from a very disempowered, almost pathological perspective. There's a focus on deficits, but we want to be asset-based, strength and resiliency-based. And trauma-informed care gives us a kind of a vocabulary to think about it in that way. It's important that, there's also an acknowledgement of power relationships that exist, that a trauma-informed care system can also be a lens to help us think through. Next slide, please. So just a few key points to remember. Healthcare itself can be a source of trauma, and going into clinical settings, again, particularly for communities, people from communities that have a history of experiencing trauma and oppression from certain systems and institutions. So the clinical setting itself can be a source of trauma. And that ultimately we have to imagine relationships and institutions that where there is cultural equity in leadership and training, and moving beyond cultural competence as sort of a bunch of workshops where you're taught how not to offend people, in more cultural competence that looks at, again, power, and looks at equity and leadership across cultures and things like that, particularly understanding that institutions can be very traumatizing, and one of the ways to address that is in leadership and organizational culture. Next slide, please. So I'm really happy about this webinar this afternoon. We're going to talk very in depth about trauma, systemic trauma, and really offer through this dialogue an opportunity to have a different conversation around how we as activists, researchers, clinicians can address trauma, can think about trauma, particularly in the context of racial justice and social justice. With that said, thank you so much.
Hey, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is Kevin Jefferson, and I just want to start by really thanking Charles for reaching out and inviting me and Dr. Abigail Sewell to this webinar. And I'll just give a little bit of background before I kind of launch into the first part of this presentation. So Dr. Sewell and I have a paper planned where we will be talking about systemic trauma, and Dr. Sewell is the lead author on that paper. And so for that reason, I actually put her as the first presenter here. And she actually asked me to switch the presenter order in this presentation because systemic trauma is the piece that I'm actually really excited about. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I just want to say that I'll be talking first about systemic trauma, and then Abigail will be talking more about some of the health effects that we see from policing, and I'll, just before that, be talking about policing as a site of trauma. She really is doing a lot of cutting edge research looking at the health effects of policing. So I think that will be a really great part of the webinar. And then I'll just also preface kind of some of the reasons why I'm so interested in systemic trauma. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And that's because it's something that I've been seeing everywhere. I think if I say the phrase systemic trauma just implicitly, I think we kind of have an idea of what it is. And I think many of us actually do see it everywhere. Let's see, more personally, I'm approaching it as well from this place of, I am somebody who lives with PTSD. That comes from early life experiences and also experiences I've had as a trans person. With my Emory student health insurance, and as a white person, I had a lot of access to getting diagnosed with PTSD. But then I look around my communities of friends, and I see a lot of people with the exact same symptoms that I have, who don't have access to a diagnosis. So that's really my starting place for thinking more and more about systemic trauma. And oh, great, perfect. Here's the next slide. So I'm thinking of systemic trauma as collective and community trauma, as well as interpersonal trauma. Here I'm really focusing on racism because I think, I really see white supremacy as, the overarching issue, but I do just also want to acknowledge that there are other intersecting oppressions as well. And so I'm really seeing this as basically, a lot of the trauma, that, basically everything that lies behind inequity. So, at the top, I kind of have this bold thing called ideology. So I'm thinking of that in terms of the ideology of white supremacy and, the different intersecting oppressions, as really being a system of owning and controlling bodies. So I see as part of the ideology of white supremacy, there's something that Tyrone Foreman has really talked about as a lack of human-heartedness from whites. And so that's, just simply not acknowledging human connections, not acknowledging human suffering, and it leads to a lot of dehumanization. Right, the dehumanization that we as whites have to do to perpetuate racism. Also coming out of this ideology and the system of owning and controlling bodies is also criminalization, which we definitely saw. Well, okay. Anyways, I'll come back to this in a second. Let's see, I'll actually just kind of drop down then. So ideology then actually shapes society in terms of laws, policies, what we see in the media, kind of general public discourse. And I'll also just preface that I really could only just, fit a few examples into this picture. So I'll just kind of be highlighting a few things, but this by no means is a exhaustive model or anything like that. But okay, if we want to talk about, say, lack of human-heartedness, I think we really saw that in terms of the Katrina response. There were so many news media, just like, I guess it's a clip, yes, that's what I'm looking for. There are so many clips of Black people in New Orleans, getting food and supplies that they need just to take care of themselves, and the news media covered that, saying, "Oh, these people are looting." You see a very similar clip where white people are going to get, food, diapers, whatever, and the news media says, "Oh, people are getting, just supplies that they need to survive." So, we really see that lack of human-heartedness and also that criminalization as well, just in terms of Katrina. And I mentioned Katrina just because it is, an event that really was and is such a huge collective trauma. If we want to go back into history and look at other roots of systemic trauma, we can look at the segregation that happened around the time of redevelopment. So, this is where eminent domain was used a lot to, uproot and displace a lot of Black communities. And whole communities were just torn down, destroyed, people had to relocate. Even if people moved back to the same places, there was still this disruption that had happened. This is something that Mindy Fullalove writes a lot about. She has a really great book out where she talks about this concept, root shock. You can think of a metaphor of a tree being, dug up by its roots and those roots being hacked. Well, if we think of, actual communities as having roots, essentially redevelopment came along and just tore those roots out. And, we can look at legacies of segregation too, redlining, all of that. We can move forward in time and look at current gentrification, which really appears to be a continuation of segregation. And, what we're seeing is the same pattern again of communities being displaced. We can look at kind of just more generally on the societal level, mass incarceration, and all the different things that are really fostering police violence. So we can go back to the 80s and 90s when a lot of three strikes laws were being passed. These are all this is all in the societal discourse. And this is giving rise just to more and more sites of trauma. So then when we kind of look at individuals interacting with other individuals in society, we'll see systemic trauma continuing to play out. So we see that in terms of violence from, say, prison guards, connected again to mass incarceration. We'll see police violence. We'll see inequities in sentencing, racial inequities in sentencing, so that's driven by judges. And, we also see violence from white vigilantes and juries that are then letting people get off. And I just also want to flag that with this, I'm talking about a lot of examples that can be seen as kind of societal issues, and they are, but I also just really want to emphasize that there are still individuals who are making these decisions. There are still individual judges who are doing the sentencing. And so it's really one of these things where the actions of individuals are both shaped by society, but then they also maintain systemic trauma. So that's actually why I have an arrow going between ideology and the interpersonal level. Let's see, interpersonally too, I think, we really need to broaden what we think about as trauma, just more generally. We'll recognize disruptive life events of discrimination, such as housing or job discrimination, but we don't necessarily talk about so-called microaggressions as trauma. Microaggressions can be like 1,000 paper cuts, and across the life course, they can really, really add up. In general, I think one of the main points about systemic trauma is just that it is all-encompassing and chronic. And a lot of it is kind of the general stressors that all people live with, but then it becomes magnified by systemic traumas. So we can talk about health inequities and lack of access to care. Okay, a lot of people, are affected by health issues, but then it becomes magnified in a racist system. And, we can look at then just, what does it mean then when you're an individual living in a racist system and, you're losing so many friends, like, each month or each week practically somebody close to you is being lost. Or, you have friends who are struggling to get access to healthcare, and, you're getting phone calls at midnight from a friend who's suicidal, and this is happening, on a fairly frequent basis. These are traumas that, are all-encompassing or all chronic, and it all just becomes magnified, just more so over time. And let's see, there's another point that I also just want to really emphasize too. Actually, maybe we could just go back to the previous slide super quick. Okay, thanks. There's a little piece here that says vicarious trauma. So I just want to flag that witnessing systemic trauma in society and interpersonally can be a special form of vicarious trauma, where it really has a whole other effect when you share a marginalized social identity with whoever is targeted. Because this is then working on the level of identity, and so then something can become more of a threat when we're looking at the level of identity. So for example, when I hear news coverage about some random person being killed, it doesn't have the same effect on me as when I see news coverage about a trans woman being killed. Because I have a shared social identity, that affects me on a whole other level. And let's see. All right, I think we can probably go back to the next slide. A lot of these points I've already covered, actually. I'll just actually flag as well. So Charles talked about historical trauma. And so I think we can also we also need to think about systemic trauma as how it's maintained over time and being transferred intergenerationally. So society changes to perpetuate systemic trauma across cultural changes. So if we think about kind of, how there was segregation and redlining, okay, well, the civil rights movement comes along. We have a lot of conversation about segregation, and okay, suddenly society says, oh, well, we can't do this. We can't, we can't basically appear to be racist. And so I should say white society says that. And then we have things moving ahead of time, moving along in time. We see this rise of mass incarceration and voter disenfranchisement. And now we have, dynamics of segregation. It's just being called gentrification. So, society has just really changed. As culture has changed, society's just changed to be able to perpetuate systemic trauma in different ways. And, also along those lines, and along the lines of historic trauma, trauma is something that is also embodied, and it affects future generations. So we see this in terms of, fetal development, where babies that are born preterm and then grow up and give birth are more likely to have preterm babies themselves. There's been some research in terms of epigenetics that shows that experiences of discrimination actually are changing how genetics are expressed, and which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. So there's actually just many different ways that this gets played out. It's not just in the realm of culture. And let's see. If we look, though, more specifically at policing as systemic trauma, oh, cool, thanks. We see the same ideology. We also see these same dynamics of, segregation and root shock in communities that have been completely torn up and displaced, which actually facilitated creating and then policing the crack epidemic, in the 80s and stuff. We see again these same dynamics of gentrification and segregation moving forward in time. And now what we see is this idea of quality of life policing. So we see all these laws against, standing loitering, sex work, that are being disproportionately enforced. So we see also this rise of policing as a source of revenue. We see more stop and frisk laws popping up throughout the country. Let's see, even in terms of where police are distributed, in what neighborhoods. We'll see, for example, neighborhoods like Midtown in Atlanta. We see neighbors clamoring for more of a police response, and then more police actually being in those neighborhoods. We'll see trans women of color being arrested for sex work just for walking while trans in particular neighborhoods. We'll see these statutes about we'll see police basically justifying those arrests based on how somebody looked or what somebody was wearing. But in another neighborhood, white cisgender woman can be walking down the street wearing the exact same thing, and she's not perceived as a sex worker. She's not arrested. So, we see all of these things compounding, and, these are all contributing to this real crisis of mass incarceration and a fostering of police violence, which we also see roots of this in like the 80s and 90s with a real racialization of drugs and welfare. People can think back to when Bill Clinton was president and just, that narrative where there was really the stereotype of, the welfare queen who, was a single black woman using drugs, having, a bunch of kids to get more government money, right? That was the cultural discourse at the time. So we see a big slashing of welfare benefits and an increasing of the carceral state, an increase in mass incarceration. Let's see, and then in terms of actual prison conditions, we see a lot of inequitable conditions, overcrowding, inadequate care, a lot of people in prison not being able to get access to, basic health care that they should have. We see these effects in terms of housing restrictions, voting and work restrictions, where if somebody has, has a record, in many places they're not allowed to vote if they have a felony conviction, and there's a lot of ways that people also blocked out of work as well. Let's see. Let's just kind of dropping down a little bit more into the interpersonal level. We've all been talking a lot about this idea of there being excessive, invasive, and/or violent policing. And so, this isn't just the police killings that we're seeing. This is also, all the times people are being stopped and frisked or just stopped and questioned. All this stuff adds up over time. We know that there's racial inequities in arrest. We know there's racial, so, those are individual police officers who are then acting in a discriminatory way and are being a site of trauma. We know there's racial inequities in sentences. So these are judges and juries who, as individuals are sites of trauma. There's inequities in terms of time served. So, these are parolee examiners who are then becoming a site of trauma. We know that black individuals end up serving much more time than white people. Also, if we just kind of step back and look at, individuals in communities, when an individual is in jail or is in prison, there's also oftentimes a forced family separation. And then those people who are left behind have, more burdens, more caregiver burdens, and less resources, to be able to take care of their own needs and, the needs of their family and community. So, again, we see it as something that's all-encompassing and chronic, over individuals' lifespans and over the span of history as well. And with that, I'll actually go ahead and turn it over to Abigail to talk more about the health effects.
Hello, can you hear me? I hear a little bit of an echo. Hello?
I think you should be good now, Abigail.
Okay, awesome. So my name is Abigail Sewell. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Emory University. And my entry into this project really actually comes from a completely different line of inquiry about the political economy of racial health disparities. So from that perspective, I developed a multi-level root cause theory of why Blacks, Latinos are more likely to have worse health than whites. And the main thesis is that an ideology of race produces political economic structures that are implicated in racial inequality by way of neighborhood context. And the key way of conceptualizing the political economy is with something I call racist racial structures, which are institutionalized sources of treatment bias that develop out of the actions and inactions of institutional gatekeepers. And in the project that I was doing before I started working on policing and health, I was looking at how mortgage markets, or the mortgage markets that people were embedded in, particularly children in Chicago, was actually harmful to their health, and how we could actually code what lenders and loan officers, underwriters do to applications as ways of tracking how disinvestment by the mortgage market industry creates community health risk profiles for residents of these communities. And then, I finished most of that work in 2012. And then there were a lot of highly publicized killings of unarmed men, Black unarmed men. And I'm thinking right now, I'm actually thinking Eric Garner was the first case that really touched me. And then Mike Brown, and it was around that time that I met Kevin, and he indicated that he had access to a data set, which is actually public available, but he had put into work to geocode the data set, which was the New York City Stop, Question, and Frisk database. So basically, New York City was sued by a number of entities for racially discriminating against people in the implementation of their stop and frisk policy. And so they had to start collecting data on who they were stopping, including the demographics of the person they stopped, the pedestrian they stopped, as well as the features of the stop itself. So these features include things such as whether the person was frisked, whether it was force used against the person, whether the person was searched, whether the person was issued a summons or arrested, and whether other people in the person's party were stopped, questioned, and frisked. So when I looked at the data set, I thought that we could actually use this to describe the political economy of the carceral state. So it was a way for me to transfer a lot of the knowledge that I had gained about the political economy or political economic structures in the mortgage market to a completely different institution, and see whether the general framework of studying the action and inactions of institutional gatekeepers really actually worked in a different institutional setting. So since then, we published 2 papers, and there are a couple of the papers that are in progress. But I'll just talk about the evidence from the 2 papers that we've actually published, since you can find them online. I'd be more than happy to share them with folks at your request. But essentially, we start off with this idea that what we've learned from doing this analysis is that the neighborhood environment that stop and frisk policing creates may be a risk factor for both physical and mental health. So what is this neighborhood environment that we're talking about? So what we're talking about is, number one, that you have a lot of stops per non-institutionalized residents. So on average, there are about 30 stops per 100 non-institutionalized residents. About 55% of those stops involve some type of frisking of the body. So frisking is just a pat down of the body. And then about 21% of those stops involve use of force by police. And use of force can include quite a number of things. But this is what we're focused on is the force that police use, not necessarily the force that that people use against police. And then what we also look at is racial disparities in those three indicators. So number one, there's a 6-to-1 ratio of minorities to whites in the likelihood of being stopped. So minorities, blacks and Latinos in New York City are 6 times more likely to be stopped by the police than are whites. Blacks and Latinos have a 25% increased likelihood of being subject to a frisk if they are stopped, and a 28% increase in the likelihood of having forced use against them if they are stopped. And all of that happens in the context of very low levels of arrest. So only about 7% of stops actually result in an arrest. So this is the neighborhood environment that stop and frisk policing creates for people mainly who are not in the criminal justice system. So these are pedestrians that are walking through a neighborhood, and the police think that they are suspicious of, or that they suspect them of doing a crime. What we found is that we can link these 6 different indicators of the stop and frisk policing environment to a range of health outcomes, including the probability of reporting poor fair health, general health, the probability of a diabetes diagnosis, the probability of a high blood pressure diagnosis, the probability of having an asthma episode within the past year, of having a body weight status that's overweight or obese, as well as reporting symptoms of nonspecific psychological distress. And nonspecific psychological distress includes such things as it includes sadness, worthlessness, nervousness, and so on and so hopelessness, feeling like things are taking a lot of effort, and so on and so forth. So in the first study that we published, we found that uniformly, if you lived in a neighborhood where there was a high level of frisking, it increased the likelihood of reporting physical health problems, poor fair health, diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, overweight, or obesity by at least 8%, if not up to 20%. So the likelihood that you, as someone who is still living in that neighborhood, is going to report a poor health problem increased by somewhere between 10 and 15% on average for residents living in neighborhoods where police stop pedestrians and frisk them. In a second study, we found that we actually could extend those findings to non-specific psychological distress. So this is actually a clinical indicator, so that you actually score very high on an indicator of experiencing a lot of psychological symptoms within the last month. So basically, one of our most consistent indicators of poor health is just whether you live in a high frisk neighborhood. Number two, we found that minorities in that first study that was published in Journal of Urban Health report worse physical health in environments, in certain environments that are created by stop, question, and frisk. So I'll break that down a little bit. It's a little much, but I just want to see if you can walk through what that means. Number one, blacks reported more high blood pressure if they lived in an area where there was a lot of stops. The increase in high blood pressure was to the tune of about 10%. And they also reported higher levels of high blood pressure if they lived in a neighborhood where there were a lot of racial disparities in the likelihood of being frisked, to the tune of about 13%. But it was beyond blacks. I mean, blacks are kind of our quintessential case for thinking about how the structural inequality gets under the skin. But we also found these patterns with Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. And in particular, the Asian Pacific Islander results are interesting because Asian Pacific Islanders are actually less likely to be stopped, less likely to be frisked, and less likely to have use of force against them if they are stopped than are whites. So even among Asian Pacific Islanders, they reported poor or fair health to the tune of an increase of 32% if they live in a neighborhood where there were large racial disparities in use of force. And then Latinos, they are treated very similarly to blacks with regards to stop and frisk policies. Even though they don't necessarily always live in the same areas as blacks, they reported higher levels of high blood pressure in areas where there was a lot of frisking and a lot of use of force to the tune of 17 to 21%. So we saw fairly substantive increases in poor health problems among minorities, particularly relationships that cannot be ignored from the perspective that we have a combination of minorities being more subject to frisking and use of force or aggressive or invasive police tactics, and also bearing the brunt of those physical health problems as well. And then the more recent study that was published looked at whether males in particular who lived in those communities where there was high levels of stopping, frisking, and use of force were more likely than their female counterparts who lived in those neighborhoods to experience psychological distress. And we found that, in fact, the effect of force was stronger on men, was stronger than that of use of frisking. So if you lived in a neighborhood, if men lived in a neighborhood where there was high levels of frisking, there was more nervousness, more worthlessness among men compared to women, and the gender gap was significant. And as well as you saw higher levels of general clinical indicators of nonspecific psychological stress, as well as increases in nervousness, feelings of effort, and feelings of worthlessness to the tune of between 12 and 18% increases if they lived in a neighborhood where there was high levels of use of force. So that's the evidence that's out there right now. What we're doing, I'm working on two papers. One is really trying to capture, is actually almost finished, trying to capture the community health risk of what we call legal intervention deaths. Legal intervention deaths are deaths that occur through some formal police force. And I'm not referring to force as in bodily force, but I'm talking about a set of police people who are acting within the bounds of the law. So basically, these are folks who are able to kill folks with a lot of times without any accountability. And what we find is that in areas where there's a high density of legal intervention deaths, not only is there more health problems, more physical health problems in that neighborhood, but there's also much stronger health problems among women living in that neighborhood. So the diabetes, asthma, high pressure, overweight or obese body status, and poor fair health increases significantly so for women in those neighborhoods, even more so than for men. So it increases for men, but it increases more so for women. And then the last paper is a paper that shows a really interesting effect where if we're able to identify the ways that minority males, people who are coded as males by police, the ways that they are have force used against them, if they have force used against them more so than their white male counterparts and their minority female counterparts, then you see higher levels of both mental and physical health problems in those neighborhoods as well. So that's where I will end with the evidence that we have, and just talk about a little bit. And I think Kevin can kind of finish this up. But there's really a need to recognize systemic trauma, particularly as systemic trauma that is circumscribed by place. This is the argument that I make. that we need to start thinking about the level of trauma that occurs to communities, and we need to make a space for that, both in healing circles as well as clinical circles, and really push mental health providers as well as researchers to recognize and address the racialized violence of trauma. So, you know, some of there's two ways that race comes into this from my way of thinking about the carceral state. One is that Black and brown bodies are more likely to be caught up in the carceral state. But the other thing is that Black and brown bodies are more likely to be affected by the carceral state, even if they're not in the system themselves, because they often have family members or friends who are in the system, or they are under, they feel as if they are under attack by these institutional gatekeepers that get you into the system. So from that, I'll turn over the rest of this last slide to Kevin to talk about more of the public health implications of the evidence that we found.
Okay, so I don't actually really have that much to add on, but you know, I'll just also highlight there's been a lot of attention on police getting crisis intervention training, which I mean is really important. Police should have training for how to handle mental health crises, but I think there also needs to be training about, well, okay, I think we need to move from crisis intervention training to crisis prevention training. So I just think police need to be just, you know, more broadly educated on mental health. I think there are a lot of symptoms of, trauma disorders such as dissociation or numbing, you know, are being triggered, being visibly triggered, that might be, perceived by police as somebody being non-responsive or being aggressive. And so police might not necessarily see this as a mental health crisis, but, you know, mental health is still very, very salient in these interactions. We know that race deeply affects, how police perceive a situation, and also even how mental health providers perceive clients. The actual diagnosis of PTSD, it has, largely been based, on the experiences of white people. White people are more likely to get a PTSD diagnosis. And so, those dynamics of systemic trauma and also how racism shows up in interpersonal relationships, including relationships with in therapy with mental health providers, it's just not, that's not really understood. So, this is something that's, chronic and pervasive. Police need to be educated about mental health more broadly, and they also need to be educated about the importance of race and how race shapes their own perceptions to, decide if something is a mental health crisis or a mental health symptom, or to decide if somebody is just being non-cooperative or aggressive. So that's a conversation that needs to be had. Let's see. Yeah, I guess I don't really have that much more to add on to it besides that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin and Abigail, for your presentation. I would like to note that for those individuals that do choose to download the presentation, the references for the information that Kevin and Abigail shared will be available. So at this time, we're going to move to our Q&A section, and I am going to bring Charles Stevens back into the discussion for some questions to our panelists. But I also want to encourage everyone who's joining us, and once again, I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar. But please go ahead and use your questions panel at this time to ask questions of our panelists. So that questions panel is located in your control panel. If you expand it, type your question in the question box and press send. I'll be able to see that question, and then we can share that question with our panelists for response. Charles, can we hear you at this time? Give us one moment. All right, give us a moment. So, we are going to go ahead. Please go ahead and submit your questions into the question box as Charles comes in from mute. All right. So while we wait for Charles, I'm going to go ahead and I would like to to open this up to our attendees who are joining us for questions. So once again, if you go ahead and use our questions panel, which is there in the control panel, um, you can type your question in and then we will go ahead and share that question with our panelists. So I'll give that a minute for individuals who'd like to share. All right. So, I have not seen any questions come through. So at this time, I want to go ahead and thank all of our panelists. So, Kevin Jefferson and Abigail Sewell, um, thank you so much for participating in this particular webinar. And thank you so much to Charles Stevens for moderating this webinar. And it looks like we had some technical issues there at the end. I am sorry about that. But give me 1 second, actually. Let's see if we can get Charles back into the discussion because I think he did have some questions he wanted to share. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to put our panelists on mute and give us one moment. We do have some questions. Hold on. While we resolve the technical issue that we're experiencing, we have had a question come in for our panelists. So, Abigail and Kevin, I'd like to share this question. That question is, have we had any actual meetings with law enforcement on how to address problems? So, this is not just with officers, we're talking about the entire police system. Abigail and Kevin, any insight on that question?
For me, no, I haven't, and I've had that question asked to me before. Um, I have the closest to this I've gotten is a colleague of mine at the University of Maryland who does a community-based participatory research with Prince George's County Police Department, and some of the findings from our studies have been shared with them. But the extent to which they're doing anything about that, or the extent to which it is moving and affecting them, I don't know about that. But I have not had any direct contact with any police officers about the research.
And I think this is something that really varies place to place. And I'm just thinking about this in terms of the problem just more broadly, not necessarily specific to this research, but just more broadly. Something that I'm aware of that is happening in a couple different places throughout the United States is the adoption of pre-arrest diversion programs. And so these are programs where police, instead of taking somebody to jail for a quality of life arrest, or drug use or sex work, they instead have option of referring people to comprehensive social services. This doesn't address all the issues, but the way that these programs, I should say the ideal way that these programs are being set up is it is actually a collaboration between community members and police departments and judges, government officials. And so within that context, there might be some room for improvement. But these are just a few model programs throughout the states. And even these programs, they're a starting point, and that should not be diminished at all. But there is also just so much more that needs to be done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Abigail and Kevin, for response to that question. Let me check our questions box to see if any more questions have come in. Okay. Well, I am going to go ahead and thank our panelists once again for joining us. I don't see any more questions that have come in from all of the participants that have joined us today. So I want to thank Charles and Abigail and Kevin for joining us on this particular webinar. Please look out for a link that will come to everyone through email, which will include a link to this particular presentation so that you can rewatch, as well as the information that was shared. So thank you so much on behalf of the Counter Narrative Project for joining us for our webinar today, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.